Diplomats and investors are among those who will be allowed entry into South Africa from the 31 high-risk countries. International travel is set to resume tomorrow with the country now settled under lockdown level 1. Malungelo Boy reports.
Government says South Africa is now open for international travel, but not everyone is welcomed just yet. Those from countries marked as high risk include nations whose coronavirus infection rate and deaths is higher than South Africa. Only certain exemptions will be made.
Travelers for leisure purposes from high-risk countries will not at present be permitted into South Africa. Only persons who are high-skills visa holders, who are investors in the economy of South Africa, will be allowed entry if they are from a high-risk country, or diplomats, as is currently the regulatory position.
The long list of countries include the UK, US, France, Russia, India, among others.
Anybody who's having a visa that expired has got nothing to fear. This means that visas, I'm talking about people, by the way, who are inside South Africa on visas already. This means that visas lawfully issued and expired during the period of the lockdown remain valid until then on the 31st of January, as I said. Holders of such visas are permitted to remain in the country under the conditions of their visit until then. Those wishing to be repatriated to their countries within this period can depart without being declared undesirable.
Government insists those traveling into South Africa will have to produce a PCR report not older than 72 hours.
The test must be conducted by a certified medical practitioner, and the certificate you produce at point of entry must have the name and signature of the practitioner who conducted the test. I think this must be communicated very, very clearly for every traveler to know that we expect them to arrive at point of entry with a certified PCR test. Upon arrival at a port of entry, travelers will be screened for any COVID-19 symptoms. So the fact that you have a certificate does not mean we won't take your temperature, does not mean we won't screen. We will continue to screen.
The minister says the list on the classifications of countries will be updated every 2 weeks as new data on coronavirus infections becomes available. For Newzroom Afrika on Channel 405, I'm Malungelo Boy in Pretoria.
Now, to help us understand the country's readiness to welcome international travelers, I am now joined by Airports Company South Africa's CEO, Mpumi Mpofu. Good evening, and thank you very much for joining us, CEO. Let's talk then about this complication that is now been, of course, brought onto us by the Department of Home Affairs. I mean, it's a long list of countries that are not permitted to come into the country at the moment. What is the plan and what engagement have you entered into with your staff and those who are on the ground in preparing them to be able to handle this kind of situation?
Good evening, Thabo, and good evening to your viewers. We actually think the outline provided by the ministers this afternoon is actually quite simple. The countries that are listed are prevented from bringing leisure travelers to South Africa. They are allowed to bring business, arts, sports, investors, and researchers and other travelers into South Africa. So what really clarifies the matter is just the distinction of stopping leisure travelers coming into our country. So we don't operate with countries as such. As you know, we operate with airlines. So the airlines from those respective countries have applied to us for slot allocations, and we can confirm to you several airlines that are coming in on the 1st of October into South Africa to bring this category of travelers. Now, the way the process works is after the ministers have issued the directives, like they did this afternoon, the Civil Aviation Authority then issues a NOTAM, which is a notice that is issued to all airlines to give them the full detail of the requirements before they board passengers in those various countries. One of the provisions is that people must provide proof of accommodation, but also provide proof of the reason they are traveling to South Africa. It's actually quite simple. The airlines will simply prohibit people who do not fall in those categories that are listed and allow those who do to get onto the airline. Yeah. And we in South Africa will receive, by and large, people who actually fall in the correct categories coming from those particular countries in those airlines that have already been provided slots by ourselves in relation to the list of countries that has been issued today. So
the question then of valid PCR tests, how will you determine that from the various countries of origin where the people will be coming from?
Airlines are not allowed to board somebody at the point of departure unless they produce that PCR test, which is valid for not less than 72 hours. So people will just simply not get onto the aeroplane. And that's basically how the systems work. And you would know that on the airline, as soon as they have finished and ready to depart, there's a list that's normally provided. That list is then sent to the receiving country, and we're able to determine that all people on board meet our requirements because the airlines would have actually done their work in getting the correct people onto the airlines and preventing those who do not meet the requirements from doing so. So those correct people, as they arrive, would still be subjected to screening, the temperature screening as is the norm. They will be wearing masks, and if they exhibit high temperatures, they will then be tested, and if they are positive, they will then be taken into quarantine, mandatory quarantine for 10 days at their cost. And we know this because, in essence, this is likely to be the one odd person who has escaped the heavily regulated process we run in the aviation industry, starting from boarding at departure. So the system basically eliminates people as they board because they are not allowed to get onto the aircraft unless they meet the requirements of the country they are going to.
So something like travel insurance, which the minister is saying now has got to be mandatory if you're going to be travel, particularly internationally, because it should be able to pay for things like that quarantine and any other requirement that will be required should you come into the country and test positive. Will you be holding those airlines accountable if that is not done?
Absolutely. The airlines wouldn't take the risk because we simply, at point of arrival, if the passengers do not have those requirements, have them sent back to the country of origin at the cost of the airline. So the airline incur penalties when they allow passengers to do wrong things, and they wouldn't risk it. A lot of them have been decimated by COVID. They haven't been making revenues. They will just simply stick strictly to the rules. Otherwise, they incur the cost.
Now, you mentioned earlier on you already have a list of countries that are applying to dock at your airports. Is there an eagerness from international travelers to make it to South Africa for business purposes?
Oh, there is, absolutely. You must remember that South Africa also serves a purpose of a hub for the region. So not only are people quite anxious to come into South Africa for business, which they've not been allowed to since the lockdown 6 months ago, but importantly, they would also like to access other parts of the region, hubbing through our critical airports such as OR Tambo, and actually on travel to other countries in the region for business purposes. So this is a really welcome relief for most business people internationally to be able to reestablish their business connections, go to their business partners in various parts of the continent via South Africa or even in South Africa itself. We're quite happy to be receiving business contingencies that will be coming through, but I also think our government is to be applauded for expanding that definition beyond that simple definition of business to include sports, diplomats, investors, highly skilled people and others, because in a sense, those people are coming here for a clear purpose to add value to our economy, and they would be coming with very distinct visits that really would benefit all of us.
What's your advice then for South Africans who would want to travel to certain countries where they are permitted to travel to right now, in terms of things like quarantining, and they might have to be locked up for 10 days before they are allowed back into normal society? I mean, what advice would you say they need to take in terms of planning their travel?
It would be very important for passengers leaving South Africa to really plan their trips much better than they've ever been required to in the past. Firstly, the obligation is on them to look and check via the airline they would be using to go to the country of their destination, to check at what the regulations of that country is. Because whilst there are standards globally guided by the International Civil Aviation Organization, the Airports Council International, it is actually quite important to note that countries have minor variations of what they allow at this time, given the advice they are getting from World Health Organization and their own governments. So know what the country of your destination requires you to have, meet those requirements, work with your airline, your travel agent to make sure that you've met all the requirements. Otherwise, you really run the risk of being turned back if you haven't met the requirements of those countries. But the first port of call is the airlines in the first place shouldn't be allowing you to board if you don't meet the requirements. They are very au fait with the requirements of countries they fly to. They are required in law to comply with those requirements. And by and large, it is very seldom that we normally have problems in this area of determining passenger requirements and making sure that passengers fulfill them.